Today we're going to examine why organizations change, what it is they can change in the organization, how they change, and then spend some time examining how difficult it is to get change in an organization and a few tactics to overcome the long-standing and widespread resistance to change. But why do they have to change? Well, if we take a look at the first overhead, we want to think of change as a survival tactic. In other words, if organizations do not keep pace with rapidly changing technology, with consumer demands, with effective business processes, they will lose their competitive edge. Let's look at a couple of examples and get a feel for some of this change. I think one of the most dramatic examples where we will be seeing change taking place is in financial institutions in the Far East. We've just witnessed the effect of an extremely rapid expansion in the Far East, and along with that, some changes that had not taken place in the way industry and banks and other security institutions were organized and the way they functioned. They've come near collapse in some areas. The International Money Fund is stepping in, Monetary Fund is stepping in to do some rescue work. And this outside force, plus the apparent chaos that went in, will cause change in those institutions. So change abroad, and institutions are not just changing in the US, they're changing all over. One area. All of you worked real hard over the past few days at your computers using word processors, and I would gather that most of you were probably using a word processor called Microsoft Word. Dominates pretty much the industry at this point. But if you go back to early stages of what went on, we can see that there were, I'm trying to think the one, I started out with something called WordStar. I don't know if WordStar exists anymore. Then went to something that had another short life called Xyrite. Where is Xyrite? Went on to another one called Multimate and used that for maybe at least a year. And then finally settled on WordPerfect. WordPerfect is still here. And WordPerfect is probably the word processor that has the second largest share in the marketplace. So we have two. What happened to all of the other ones? Where did they go to? Well, those that can't keep pace with what's going on fall by the wayside. So businesses open up every year and businesses close every year. Some are not successful. Some don't adapt to the changes that need to take place. Yesterday was a day on the stock exchange where Westinghouse Corporation ceased to exist, transformed itself into CBS. What happened to all of those components of this industrial giant called Westinghouse? Sold to various parts. No longer in the power business, no longer in the electrical electronics business. All of those parts sold off, and they metamorphized, well, they morphed, let me use that expression, into CBS, News and Entertainment. It transformed to keep up with what they thought would best fit their now core technology. So change going on all the time. Do any companies endure over the decades? Sure. Macy's has been around for a long time, under different ownerships, but has survived. Sears has been around for a long time. The Bank of New York goes back to the 1700s. A long time. The newspaper, the New York Post, was started by Alexander Hamilton. Changed, for sure. One of the changes we see happening now in newspapers, color on a regular basis. The New York Times just recently brought color in. One of the papers with the largest circulations in the US feels the need to keep up with what was happening in smaller papers, which were more advanced, but needs to compete so it doesn't fall by the wayside. So obviously institutions have to change. If we go to the second overhead, we want to see what makes for success in organizations. Peter Senge, I have to try his name either way, has popularized the term the learning organization. What is a learning organization? It almost sounds like a misnomer. How does an organization learn? Individuals learn. But it proves to be a useful metaphor for organizations which acquire information and apply that information so they can adapt to and cope with change. That's what we do as individuals. That's how learning serves us as individuals. And now we take a look and see how learning can help organizations as well. Those that apply the acquisition, dissemination, interpretation, and storage of information are those that can cope with change. Let's take a look at some of the components. Knowledge acquisition. Those organizations that, one, invest in their employees so that they can acquire knowledge, and that encourage their employees to share knowledge with each other so that there is an emphasis constantly on acquiring new information, are those that are going to be prepared to cope with change. They're going to know what's going on out there and what needs to be done. Information distribution. It's not sufficient for one individual to know about something. That information has to be disseminated throughout the organization. And so structures may need to be put in place so the information is disseminated. And those organizations that are thriving are those organizations that are giving information throughout the organization, information about the finances of the organization, information about products that are going to be developed in the organization. So each individual has a sense of what's happening in the organization and how their own role has some impact on the various functions within the organization. So dissemination, and given the ready availability of PCs throughout organizations, it's not hard to get this information out. It no longer resides in a few elite people within the organization. Information interpretation. You've got all this information. How do you begin to make sense out of it? Becomes important, and so we need people who will present cogent reports, distill the information that comes in, and this frequently is the work of people in MIS, Management Information Systems, to help deal with all of the information. Or we can begin to look at decision support systems that are available, expert systems that are available to help take the information that's coming in and analyze the information in aid in making cogent interpretations and cogent decisions in the organization. Another aspect of the learning organization. And finally, a key aspect. People now talk about organizational memory. Again, sounds like a misnomer. Individuals have memory. Individuals leave. They take information with them that's useful to the organization. That hurts the organization unless that information resides in some kind of file somewhere so that the next person coming in can go to that and see what steps and procedures turned out to be the most efficient and the most useful that the individual devised. And again, the basic computer can help us with storing that kind of information so that other people coming in know where to go. And you don't walk in and you ask for a piece of information in the organization and somebody says, John's out, and if John isn't here, nobody else can help you. That shouldn't be the case. Okay, that information should be available to other people so you don't have to start from scratch. And that's, as key people leave organizations, that has particularly been a problem. Again, if you look at it as an example, in computer and information systems areas, particularly where programs had been tweaked, changes had been made in the code, and it's not documented. And then you need to go look for something, and what you're looking for isn't in the code somewhere. No one had bothered to document it. That documentation turns out to be extremely important to other people coming along, trying to find out where problems might be and where you need to make changes. So all of these things are useful to organizations as they change. What are the forces that push for change in the organization? First, we're going to look at all environmental forces, all forces that are somewhat external, but divide them into planned and unplanned change. The planned change activities are those that are intentional. The organization knows that these changes are going to be made. The organization wants these changes to be made. These changes generally come from strategic decisions about where to go with the organization. What new products or services need to be added to keep up with the competition, as an example. Or what changes need to be made in size so that we can tap new markets that we hadn't thought of before. What changes need to be made in structure as an organization downsizes. Or if we look at administrative systems as an example, you know, what kinds of reward structures need to be changed? What kinds of business processes need to be changed? And finally, what kinds of changes in technology? Some examples of changes in products and services. Let's go with one of our local companies, which in itself is a changed organization, Bell Atlantic. Gone through several iterations of change since it became Bell Atlantic, and recently has merged with NYNEX, making it even larger, still Bell Atlantic. They decide to go into the credit card business. A whole new product added on. What's a telecommunications business doing in the credit card business? Well, it worked for AT&T, worked very well for AT&T. And so organizations have found going into the credit card business tends to be a successful area for revenue for them. They need to go into the cellular phone business. That makes sense. But still adding on a new service that goes on. So a change there. A pharmaceutical house needs to bring on new drugs to stay competitive. Pharmaceutical houses live and die in terms of developing new drugs to stay competitive in the market. Changes that need to be made there. GM launches Saturn to try to be competitive with the smaller Japanese cars and the high-quality Japanese cars. A change, a strategic change, a change in direction about adding on a product or service to remain competitive. Nonetheless, a need to change to stay in business. Changes in size or structure. McDonald's started out with one location, somewhere in California. A change in size. It had to grow. So sometimes organizations have to expand in order to keep up with the rapid growth that's going on. The need for hiring to keep up with the growth that's going on. Change is evolving due to growth. And you have to watch rapid growth because that sometimes can get you in trouble. Sometimes you go into overexpansion. Airlines did that at one point when there was deregulation and they were buying up routes all over the place. And some overexpanded and later contracted, and some contracted and fell away and don't exist anymore. There's also the change that comes from downsizing. You shrink, you may get rid of some areas altogether. For example, a hospital decides that it will contract out its emergency room services, as many do. That's downsizing. Those people are no longer employed by the hospital. They're now employed by some outside contractor, which is running the emergency room. That's a change in structure. A hospital decides it's no longer to run its information services. It will outsource the information services to a larger organization, because the hospital cannot remain competitive if it's small and continue to do all of the things that it needs to do in information services. But if it outsources it to a large organization, then they're flexible. That large organization can provide a lot of services for it. But it's a change in the configuration and the structure of the hospital. So all of these changes go on constantly, and you see the word that I'm using all the time, to remain competitive, to stay up there. And organizations need to work harder and harder in terms of doing it. Changes in administrative structures. What do these things entail? Changes in policies, changes in reward structure, how you pay people, changes in management styles, changes in billing systems and in accounting systems, as some examples. To be more efficient in doing commerce. A bank changes the policy on when funds become available. Change in an administrative system. Has to do it, in part due to outside regulation, but in part to remain competitive. Banks initially, in installing automatic teller machines, didn't charge at all for the use of it till we all got hooked on using them. Now they find that they can make a lot of revenue by charging people for use of the automatic teller machine. So your bank charges you when you use one that's not at the local bank, and the other bank charges you when you use it too. You're getting charged twice. Not a lot of money, but you consider all the transactions that go on each day, and the banks are racking up a lot of revenue in these changes that go on. A company makes a change in how it's going to do purchasing. Maybe formerly it was done through central purchasing, and now it's going to decentralize and give a real budget to each individual unit and say, do the best that you can. Go out to Staples, go out to Office Max. We're not going to get involved in this so much anymore. A change in administrative policy, all of these changes, again, to make the operation more efficient. And finally, changes in technology. Computer technology has been touted as the major revolution, and it continues at a very fast pace. But we're now only beginning to realize productivity enhancements from this information revolution. In part, people just weren't ready for it to begin with. The applications weren't in place, people weren't prepared to use it, but now we're beginning to see real productivity enhancements from the use of technology. Technology can change in small ways. Let's use some new piece of software that's going to be more efficient. Or it can change in huge ways, and that is, let's go from some standard type of manufacturing format to flexible cell manufacturing. So it can be a small investment in technology, it can be a huge investment. What we find with investments in technology is that it keeps changing faster and faster and faster. And organizations are not keeping up with the changes quite as rapidly. The dilemma that occurs is if you're going to derive benefit from learning and experience, you need some time to acquire familiarity with whatever system you're working on. You get used to that system, and just as you begin to get used to it, whoops, here comes the new version of it. Well, a lot of companies are just not going to be prepared to invest quite as rapidly, and things might slow down. Well, people catch up with the technology. So, but we can be sure that those that are manufacturing the technology, if they are going to remain successful, are going to have to keep bringing out new products so they remain competitive with the other ones that are out there. There is always somebody else out there eager to build the better mousetrap. So, plan change, the changes that organizations count on as they are evolving. But there's yet another force. That force is unplanned change. What accounts for unplanned change? Government regulation. It's amazing how many areas in which government seems to regulate, seems to seep into various aspects of our lives. It intrudes into the reporting of wages. It intrudes into inspections of commercial airlines. It intrudes into the food industry, the drug industry, regulation of airwaves, antitrust situations, toxic and hazardous waste, air quality, transportation, banking, and I could go on and on. We could go through the litany of the alphabet of these regulatory organizations out there. And industry, commerce, has to be ready to respond to the demands and changes that are placed on them. They have to be ahead of the game in some instances. Let's use the automobile industry as an example of responding to government regulation. In order to keep the air at a quality which is healthy, you need to have lower amounts of hydrocarbons in the air. This is just a test. The gremlins are at it. So you need to have lower amounts of hydrocarbons and hydrosulfides and all of those things. We don't want those to get too high. We don't want too much ozone in the air. And as a matter of fact, the government regulates what's a healthy amount. We have occasionally heard of smog alerts out in LA. And if you have respiratory ailments, don't go out. Problems. So there are regulations on automobile companies so that the emissions coming out of the tailpipe don't foul up the air to points where it's unhealthy. This is done, of course, they all had to put catalytic converters on. That's one of the ways that the emissions coming out are not as filthy as they used to be. But nonetheless, there is pressure through regulation to clean things up even more. We have more and more cars on the road. We have more and more emissions in the air. And so there are regulations in terms of having automobiles which will emit no hydrocarbons. What does that mean? It means you have to develop in some way so that it is usable to the consumer, the electric automobile, or some alternative fuel automobile, so that you're not going to the gas pump. What do we have? We have all of the automobile companies working on prototypes for these, particularly out in California. The electrical automobile for this area is going to be really difficult because, well, they don't work really well in cold weather. They work much better in warmer weather. And we're talking about automobiles that work with a lot of batteries. And you need to charge them frequently. So, you know, who's going to be buying these automobiles and how are they going to be used? But pressure nonetheless on the automobile companies to comply with government regulations. So examples of governments trying to bring change about in organizations. We could also use the FAA as an example, inspection of airlines and changes and recommendations that they're making there regarding safety of airlines. So another example, government regulation, economic competition. Because of economic competition, companies fight for their slice of the marketplace. How are they going to maintain it once they have it? How are they going to make sure that there are other companies that are not going to somehow attract their users away by offering the same product at a cheaper price? Well, they need to make sure somehow that they put themselves in a niche where service is seen as important if the price is going to stay up. There were airlines that were in there that were really discount airlines. One was known as ValueJet. It had a horrendous crash. And so people were willing to pay more money to ride those airlines that were able to demonstrate better safety records. You demonstrate your quality niche as an example. Or you demonstrate your ability to provide service. Why go to Nordstrom's for a product when you might be able to get it at some discount outlet? Because of the service that Nordstrom's prides itself on in terms of presentation of products to the consumer. So always competition out there, and the need to somehow get the message across to the consumer that you're providing a service which is worth buying. Why is it people use Federal Express instead of the U.S. Postal Service? Federal Express has convinced customers that they're reliable and it's worth paying the extra money to use FedEx. Or they're open longer hours and provide services that the post office doesn't provide. So need for that service out there. Small businesses open, small businesses close. At one time, we were populated with lots of local hardware stores. There were no Home Depots. But Home Depots have become the way of the world. It's harder and harder to find the small local hardware store that competes, but the local hardware store has one advantage. It doesn't take up a lot of room and it can stay in the neighborhood. You can run over there and get something quickly. Neighborhood pharmacies were once the way of the world. Now they're being bought up like crazy by all of the large chains, which offer a lot more than drugs. But that's what people are looking for. So, economic competition. And finally, performance gaps are yet another way that organizations find they must change. They find that there is poor performance of some product or service that they're issuing. In fact, that's what impelled NYNEX to merge with Bell Atlantic. The service record in terms of repairs at NYNEX was horrible. They were under orders from the state, New York State, to rebate money to customers because they weren't able to get out there and repair phone lines in a respectable amount of time. And they were just rebating more and more money. They weren't somehow able to fix their own administrative systems. The simpler solution was to merge with Bell Atlantic being the senior partner, and Bell Atlantic putting its systems in place and making the changes that were required. Rising costs. A need to change something in terms of the system. We're just spending too much money on making this product. Lagging profits, lagging revenues. The need to try out a new product. McDonald's goes after the adult market, which they seem to not be capturing, and they try a new product. It didn't seem to last for that long, right? It was the McBLT or something like that. It hit the marketplace for a while. Oh, the Arch Deluxe, right, thank you. Okay, not around anymore, disappeared. Remember the new Coke? Came out, people clamored for the old Coke, disappeared. Okay, you try something in terms of performance to get out there and get a new market, capture something, maintain your market, and you're looking at various performance gaps. Something is wrong in the organization, and that's something that's wrong. Too many strikes in the organization, too much turnover in the organization. And you have to do something if you're going to maintain your place. So all of these are forces for change in the organization. So we know then that organizations have to change. Then what is it that they can change? Well, goals and strategies. That's a big change. That's the change where you're going to launch a new product. You're going to go after a new market. You're going to do the thing that Westinghouse did and metamorphosize into CBS. You're going to merge with another organization. Strategy. You're going to reach for new levels of quality. Another example besides Westinghouse in terms of change. Most of you know the retail store called Fortunoff's. But you may not know how Fortunoff started. Fortunoff started somewhere in the heart of Brooklyn as a discount housewares store in dingy buildings with dingy displays. Hardly what you think of when you think of Fortunoff's today, as a somewhat upscale, but not necessarily full price dealer, merchant of housewares and jewelry. A real change was decided. One, to get out of Brooklyn and go to locations, in part where their customers had moved to. The customers were out in more expensive houses. They figured that they could put up more expensive stores and sell more expensive products, and people would still come back to Fortunoff's, and it worked. A change. Disney, changing goals and strategies in terms of the entertainment that it provides. At one time, Disney was exclusively cartoon movies. And the decision to branch out and move into adult movies. The decision to branch out and add the amusement parks. Okay, a change in terms of goals and strategies. Anheuser-Busch, if I say that, you're going to think of Bud. But that's not all Anheuser-Busch does. They also are large into the area of entertainment parks throughout the country. A change in strategy. Let's add on a new line. So that's one of the things that they can do, and that's a big decision. Organizations can change technology, and do. Sometimes for the wrong reasons, just because some other organization is doing it, and not because they really need it. We see now the drive to put technology into the classroom, and we seem to think that if we can provide every classroom at primary and secondary level with an internet connection, somehow we're upgrading what's going on. Okay. Only if there are people there who know how to use it and can instruct the students in the proper way and can use it properly. So companies, unfortunately, make changes in technology, make investments in technology, and then it sits, and it's wasted, and there isn't the payoff for it. Organizations can redesign jobs. Jobs can be redesigned, and it usually accompanies a change in technology. We examined this before. To add in skill variety, to add in autonomy, to decrease autonomy, to increase feedback. But it's one of the things that can be done to help enhance performance in the organization. Organizations can change their structure. They can go from a functional design to a product design. They can go to a matrix organization. They can move from mechanistic to organic. They can change how formalized they are, how centralized they are, how large the span of control is. Organizations reorganize all the time, redesign all the time, and try to make changes in these various functions. They can change processes, and we hear today particularly the terminology business process re-engineering, the attempt to change the way the business process operates and look at it end to end and see if it can be made more efficient than what is the case now. Hammer and Champy, the two gurus of this area, talk about minimizing the number of handoffs in any process, because each time a piece of paper leaves the outbox of one individual and goes into the inbox of another individual, you've got delay time. The more that one individual can work on a process, the better it is. And chances are, if you look at the actual working time on getting some function through an organization end to end, actual working time is probably relatively short. The number of days it takes has to do with inefficiency in the operation, and it's sitting on one person's desk waiting to get attended to, while that other person is dealing with some other kinds of things. So then you look at how you can combine tasks in an organization so you wind up with a much more efficient process. You can change people in the organization, and you can change people two ways in the organization. You can change people by literally getting rid of some people and hiring new people. This is done. We hear about organizations that say that they're going to offer buyouts in retirement packages as a way of moving some expensive older individuals out of the organization, and it's making room for less expensive newer individuals coming into the organization. You need to do that occasionally. If you take a look at the mix of people in the organization, so you're bringing in new people. Or you decide to go outside the organization instead of promoting from within the organization. AT&T did this recently, IBM did this recently, and they've done it successfully. They've gone outside. Change the people in the organization as a way of creating change. Or you can change the people in the organization. That is, the people within the organization themselves change. And we talked about this before, too. You change the people within the organization by upgrading their skills, by training them, by having them work in teams instead of as individuals, by investing in the people. But a change goes on within the various members in terms of their skills, their knowledge, their abilities on the job. So another way. What you need to keep in mind is that as you change any one element of the organization, other things are probably changing in the organization. If you change a job design, you ought to go back and change administrative structures in the organizations. You're going to probably need to have a different type of reward structure. And those alignment of changing one system and changing another system simultaneously are the kinds of things that we'll be looking at really next time, so we won't go into it this week as we talk about organizational development. But it is important for the success in the organization. So we've looked at why organizations change, what they change, and now how they change. The basic change process that I'm presenting is one that's called Levine's change model, named after Kurt Levine. Levine was a social psychologist that was able to get out of Nazi Germany sometime, I think late 40s, came to the US and assumed a position at the University of Iowa. He was not only responsible for this whole area that we call action research, organizational development, how you get organizations to change, but he was also responsible for the whole area that we know as group dynamics. What are the processes and the functions that go on in groups? He believed that at any time in an organization, there were forces for the status quo, kind of forces of inertia, and forces for change. And when they were in a state of equilibrium, you were in a state of what he called quasi-stationary equilibrium, but you would be able to change. At any time the forces for the status quo were stronger than the forces for change, you were going to stay entrenched. And when the reverse happened, you'd get some kind of movement in the organization. He also believed that it's easier to change an organization by reducing those forces that maintain change rather than increasing the pressures to change. And the process that he talks about is a three-step process of unfreezing, moving, and refreezing. Unfreezing is done by reducing the forces that maintain the status quo. Usually done through a process which we call psychological disconfirmation. Face up to the problem. Get real, folks. Smell the coffee, if we use slogans. This is what the problem is, and we're going to have to face it. You introduce information about the discrepancies between where we are and where we're going to need to be if we're going to survive. The second stage is moving, which is creating the new state, and at this point you have to introduce new behaviors, new attitudes, new values into the organization if you're going to have change. And finally, refreezing. You get it to the new state, but you want it to stay in that state, whatever the new state is. You don't want to slide back. You don't want to retrench. No backslipping in all of this. The need to refreeze. And that's where we call for institutionalizing change, making sure that the organization supports the very changes that it wanted and isn't somehow unintentionally and inadvertently undermining its own change process. And sometimes that happens, where organizations speak of the need for change, invest in change, and undermine their own change by failing to institutionalize it. So, the change process, but it is so difficult to accomplish. There are barriers. The tendency exists for individuals to be unwilling to go along with changes. There are lots of fears out there. Fears are often irrational in the sense that they're unreal and they are imaginary. And people tend to imagine that the system that will come into place, whatever the system is going to be worse than what is already in place. All of us resist change. Okay, why? What is it that causes us to resist change? Economic fears. There's going to be a change taking place in this organization, and I'm going to somehow lose my job security. Whatever happens, I'm going to be worse off when this whole thing finishes than I was before. That might be true. It might not be true. I mean, sometimes organizations, too often re-engineering meant downsizing, and people did lose their jobs. So sometimes those fears are real. Another reason is the fear of the unknown. Fear of the unknown tends to take place because we know what the costs and benefits are of the system that we're in. We don't know what the costs and the benefits are of the system that we're going to move to. So we tend to, in the absence of real knowledge, in the absence of having experienced whatever the new system is, inflate the costs of change, deflate the benefits, and do the reverse for the system that we're in. And so we rationally come to the conclusion, with the wrong weights attached to the costs and benefits, that where we are now is more beneficial for us than where we're going to be moving, whatever it's going to be. And you can think of it in terms of changes that you've endured. Change to a new way of registering turns out to be really good. But in the process, there's probably always grumbling and groaning. You move people to a new building, and they wind up with better office space, but in the process, they'll find all kinds of reasons why the old office, which they complained about constantly when they were in it, was better than the new place that they're moving to. Okay? So these adjustments are difficult. But once you get people over the change process, then they begin to really experience what the benefits can be and find out that usually it's not as bad as they had imagined it would be. Fear of social disruptions, yet another problem. And with fear of social disruptions, work groups become established in organizations. People establish friendships. The friendships are extremely rewarding socially. We enjoy our time with other people. We enjoy our chats with other people. We enjoy working with other people. If we imagine that whatever the new system is that's coming into place is going to disrupt and break up the work group, we're not going to be happy campers in all of this. Another reason for resisting change. Effort, effort, effort. We've all experienced the effort of changing. When you have to upgrade your computer, and you know you should do it, and you know the new system is going to be better, but you keep putting it off and putting it off because somehow it's going to involve a time investment, and you don't want to make time for that time investment. It's easier right now to keep using the old system. It takes less effort to use the old system than to make the investment and effort in upgrade to whatever the new one is. Once you finally get over the hump of upgrading, you love the new system. But it's that effort involved in the transition that we all shy away from, and go back many weeks ago to when we were talking about learning, and when we were talking about negative reinforcers. Anything that involves effort is something that we're going to likely shy away from. And so if you want to make change in an organization, try to make the change as effortless as you can for the employees of the organization. Less effort, better. People will love that. Fear of loss of power and autonomy. Them's that has the power and the resources wants to hold on to the power and resources, and if there's going to be a shift in the organization, some may lose out. So, another fear. And finally, commitment to the old position. You've invested so much in it, either in terms of your own effort and your own work, or in terms of money that's in it, that it's hard to get people to shift because of the investment, psychological and financial, in whatever the old system is. I think the best example of not shifting when you probably should shift is the failure of general managers and coaches to shift away from sports athletes in whom they've given huge contracts to but are no longer performing. They keep them out there. They're still pitching, they're still quarterbacking, they're still on the roster, occupying space because a financial investment and a psychological investment has been made in these players. And they hang on to them too long. Time to get rid of them and shift to somebody new. And so you wind up needing more of this psychological disconfirmation that we talked about than you should reasonably to get over the commitment problem. Organizations will stay with positions and policies far too long. They should have shifted a year ago. They shouldn't have hold on. They should have divested something. They should have just cut a product and say, that's it. We're not making money on it. They should have shifted personnel, but there is that commitment that holds people in. So those are individual barriers. But that's not all. We have organizational barriers as well. Structural inertia. Organizations exist to be stable, to be conservative, to keep the status quo. So you have knowledge from one day to the next of what's going on. So the training systems, the norms, the reward structure, the leadership, all work to maintain the status quo, designed to promote stability, not change. That's the nature of the organization. So we already start out with one hand tied behind the back in terms of trying to get change, because organizations are not necessarily designed for change. Work group norms. The norms of the work group function to keep things, again, in terms of status quo. This is the way we do things here. How are you going to get the work group norms to change? Pressure exists to perform a job in a particular way, to maintain certain attitudes. You're going to have to work with the whole group in order to get the shift that you want to. Threats to existing balances of power. Now we're talking at a group and unit level about the same thing that we had talked about on an individual level. The units that have the resources, the units that are more powerful, the units that are closest to the heartbeat of the president are the ones that want to stay in that position. They're not going to want to give up those types of power. Reorganization means change, and it means that there are going to be groups out there that might try to sabotage the change, slow down the change, because they stand to lose in the process. Or a history of change efforts gone wrong. We tried change. It was a failure. Why are we trying change again? It'll be a long time before Coca-Cola tries to change that product. They tried it. It didn't work. Back to the old successful formula that's locked in the vault somewhere in Atlanta, and nobody knows what exactly the formula is except for this mystique of a few people who have access to it. They won't try to change. And finally, boards of directors. These people are appointed to preserve the integrity of the firm, fiscal and otherwise. Again, a conservative force in organizations. To the extent that the board of directors is large and it's diverse and they can't reach consensus about how to change, they're not going to change. Things will stay status quo. So that's another group that you have to get over. And if you're talking about strategic change, you're not going to get strategic change unless the board of directors okays that change. It's going to take a lot of doing to move large organizations. So it takes a lot of doing. Is it possible? And the answer is it better be, because organizations have to change. How do you, at an individual level, once you're going to have to get change, once the strategy is decided to change, overcome the resistance to it? Well, start out by informing all in the organization about the pressures for change. You have to explain the environmental pressures for change, both domestic pressures and foreign pressures in terms of competition. All the individuals in the organization need to know about the competition that's out there. Who do we have to keep our eye on all the time? How much share of the market do we have? How much share of the market does the competition have? Feed that information back to all individuals. Explain the need for changing technology, that unless we keep pace with the technology, again, we're going to lose out to the competition. Show the rising costs to individuals in the organization. Show the declining revenues. Open the books up. The automobile industry did this, particularly Chrysler, as it went through some rocky times with the union. And the union was willing to accept the fact that forego increases over a number of years while the company got back on its feet. And it indeed got back on its feet. But share the information so that individuals know what the problems are. And then point out the discrepancies between the current state and the desired one. Here we get into the vision thing. You need to create among individuals the image of where the organization wants to go. Not easy to do this. And this then relies on the charismatic personality to convey that positive image, to come up with the image of what the organization is capable of doing and what each individual is capable of doing within the organization. And then convey positive expectations about change. You can do it. It's possible for you to do all of these things. Today's Wall Street Journal chronicles an interesting story about American Express and an individual who headed up a division of American Express Financial Services in Detroit. One such charismatic person. At the age of 27, he was managing the Detroit office. And he used inspiration, he used stories to bring people on board with him. He used techniques such as taking people who had a large customer base, but the customer base wasn't growing, and merging them with a younger person, pairing them with a younger person who would be more dynamic and would help that customer base to grow. Both people would benefit from that. situation. He used philosophical stories, read from philosophy to the individuals, and inspired the vision in them. He remembered individuals by name and brought them along in terms of how well they were doing. The vision thing, how to spin the story out there and get people attracted into the vision that you're creating. The Detroit office began to boom in terms of sales and revenues, doing better than many other areas, and American Express was delighted with it. He brought forth a proposal to spin loose the American Express office into something in which he alone would head, and he had all of the workforce wanting to come with him because he'd done the vision thing with him, and they saw the results. Most of them were doing well. American Express was ready to buy into it, and then they began to do some background examination, or as they said, the due diligence checks. And they found that not all people were satisfied. They found some discrepancies in some stories. And at a deal which appeared as if there was a handshake, American Express, at the last minute, couldn't get the consensus, we talked about that before, backed off. The interesting aspect of all of this is that this individual is going to go ahead with his plans for his own independent office, and he is walking off with most of the personnel from that office. They bought into his vision of where the organization can go, and they are going with him to create this new independent financial services that is going to be competing directly with American Express in Detroit. And they are, I will tell you, worried. They are worried because now they're looking at competition who knows the inside, has the organizational knowledge that we talked about before, knows where the accounts are. They're afraid of losing the accounts, that these accounts, and that's often what happens when individuals go from one organization to the next, they've built up the personal relationships. Individuals don't have a relationship to the entire organization. They have a relationship with an individual. And so they try to take accounts with them, switch it over in toto to the new organization. So here they are faced with the interesting thing of losing some of their best personnel, losing possibly accounts in competition in this area. Did they need to, in fact, go through with something that they should have? Did they not do their work initially when they should have? Maybe they should have done the due diligence reports earlier and not have agreed to the handshake. The vision thing can take you, interestingly, a long way. So an important spark in getting organizations to change and to buy into the change. So where have we been and where are we going? If we look back at what we talked about today, we considered the importance of change and the environmental forces that push for change, both planned change, the internal ones, the strategic ones, and unplanned change. We looked at the change process, and we looked at those things that account for resistance to change, and finally, ways to overcome resistance to change. Where does this leave us in terms of what we have left to accomplish this semester? Next time, we take a look at the actual tactics that are used in developing organizations as they change. Organizational development is next time.